All right, well, we've been talking about peace, and not just as this idea of absence of conflict or violence, or even just in terms of some kind of internal quiet, but actually this big idea that maybe includes those things, but it's more than that. It's the presence of something. It's the presence of wholeness and harmony in our relationships with ourselves, actually, yes, with nature and with the earth, with each other, and also with the divine, with God. And so it's not just absence, but it's presence. And it's not just personal, it's social, and it's cosmic, right? It's this big, beautiful vision that we're invited into, and then, of course, have to work it out in the detail. One of the core threads of the biblical story and the way in which peace is seen is through the lens of what is needed from the perspective of justice. And those two things are often interwoven together. So this has to do with the order and the structure of our relationships toward one another in community, right? And so it's not just that I'm able to say, things are fine for me. I'm feeling peace. Yes, I am. Things are going great. If my going great is at the expense of, or even just ignoring the suffering of vulnerable and marginalized people. And so in the biblical story, there's particularly the role of the prophets is this continued calling out about how our communities are structured and ordered, and naming the things that are uncomfortable to name, especially because typically those in power have ordered things in a way that seems quite peaceful to them, but not so much for those on the underside of these things. And so the prophets like Amos, who says, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an everlasting stream." And even the phrase, that term righteousness within kind of modern individualist spirituality has come to sort of mean this kind of personal moral perfection, but actually righteousness is about right relationships. And it's about a seeking to put things right. And so if you like, righteousness is perhaps the personal dimension of that, and justice can be thought of as the social dimension of that. Isaiah, another prophet who, if you want to read about the call for justice in the biblical tradition, then Isaiah is where you find a lot of that too. The way of peace in Isaiah 59. The way of peace they do not know. There is no justice in their paths. They have turned them into crooked roads, and no one who walks along them will know peace. This idea that those who do injustice ultimately create paths and roads that lead to violence and suffering instead of to peace and shalom. So there's this kind of prophetic tradition, right, of claiming that if we try to establish peace, but we don't have justice, then it's not real peace. Peace for some at the expense of others is not what we're talking about from the story of the scriptures and the prophets when we talk about shalom. Now we see this thread run through the story very much so of Jesus as well, right? For Jesus, peace is not kind of the peace of Rome, the rising up and the crushing of your enemies. It's not seizing power, but neither is it ignoring injustice. It's not saying, well, if I can't seize power, then I guess we just let things go the way that they are. It's not this kind of naive ignoring of injustice. In fact, Jesus constantly names and confronts injustice, but not with force or violence or power over others, but instead to name it and then say, here's a different way we could be. If you read the Gospels, Jesus is not just interested in getting along with people for the sake of it, not if he saw exploitation of the vulnerable, if he saw people being marginalized, pushed to the edges. And so in his big statement in the Gospel of Luke, for example, who records Jesus quoting Isaiah, the prophet we mentioned earlier, in this kind of way of understanding his own vocation, his own call as a prophet. And so he quotes the prophet Isaiah to say, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me and has anointed me to preach good or proclaim good news to the poor, proclaim freedom for the prisoners, sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free," and so on, right? And as scholars have pointed out, this is like an empowering and encouraging message to the poor, to the prisoners, to the oppressed, right, to the blind. But it is also a challenging message to the ones keeping them poor, the ones who have done the imprisoning, the oppressors who are pushing down the oppressed, right? And in many respects, although the story of Jesus is a long time ago now, the injustices of his time are still pretty relevant, I would say, to the injustices of our time. Jesus was living in a time of religious abuse, of using religious power to elevate some at the expenses of others. And, we have seen our fair share of stories of religious and spiritual abuse within religious institutions and communities. Jesus was also living in a time of colonisation, a Roman Empire who had conquered and colonised his people and their land. And we again live with the aftermath of colonisation in our time and place. And Jesus is also living in a time of racial prejudice and exclusion and bigotry and ethnic divides and hatred between different groups. And again, Like, these challenges remain with us today. And if we want to cultivate lives of peace, I think there's still a lot we can learn by paying attention to the story of Jesus. And it can't come about, our peace can't just be a personal individual peace if it covers over injustice. That's a peace that comes at the expense of those who suffer. It's tempting, right? If the world works for someone like me, then I'm tempted to want to keep it the way that it is. And these, pesky people can come along saying, this isn't just, this isn't right. Look how well it's been, and I can be like, what do you mean? Look how well it's been working. Back in my day, everything was fine before people started complaining. And that's the kind of sentiment sometimes we see in relation to calls for justice, that for people for whom the current system works, there's a cost. And maybe the cost is sharing power when you're used to having it. Or maybe it's giving up some power. Maybe it's choosing not to have to be the person who gives the answers, but to learn and listen and pay attention. Maybe it's allowing our communities to be reshaped with others in mind, so that even if I feel a bit less centered than I used to, it might be a more inclusive tent, right? There's a cost to us to acknowledge our unjust treatment of the environment and what it might take to see that put right, And so these are hard, gnarly kinds of questions that there's no one right answer to, but the kind of questions that people who follow Jesus should probably at some point be wrestling with and thinking about. This is not about political party affiliations. It's about what kind of person I want to be in the world, and how can I work toward justice so that we can build real peace with one another. Perhaps the last thing to say about this is that this kind of justice, it flows out of love, right? Not out of, angst. At least not at the core. There is angst and anger, and rightly so. But our desire for peace, I think, in the tradition of the Jesus story, flows out of love. That's even where that anger and angst comes from. Justice is an expression of divine love, and that matters for us about the posture we take toward it. And so the justice we see in the Jesus story, it's not solved by dehumanizing others, making ourselves the righteous crusaders who have it all right and then who want to destroy the others, right? Because that's just the same cycle. It's love for our enemies. It's naming injustice so that we can all find new ways of being human together. It's justice that brings liberation to the oppressed, yes, but also liberation to the oppressor, because in so many respects, we can be both of those within the same person. It's finding new ways to be human with each other, right? So I want to finish with this, and it's an invitation again to reflection. Here's a practice you can do, and I'm not going to take you through it at length, but just describe it to you. The instructions will be on our website that you can follow through this practice if you'd like. But basically, to take those first 2 or 3 minutes to become aware of your own presence, your own breath, your feet on the floor. You close your eyes, what sounds can you hear? That kind of classic just coming present into the moment. If you don't know what to do with that, just pay attention to your breath rising and falling in your chest. Your thoughts race around, that's okay. They can race, and then bring your attention back, right? And then once you're in that place of just kind of settledness for a moment, bring to mind maybe an issue of justice that matters to you, maybe that you're aware of. Maybe it's environmental justice, maybe it's a work situation that's unjust, maybe it's the story of colonisation, whatever it might be, personal, systemic, I don't know. Just bring it to mind and just sit with it for a moment. Even if it's a bit uncomfortable, to sit with that. You don't have to come up with answers. It's just acknowledging, here is this situation. And then the invitation there is to just imagine, if we think about the prophet Amos's language, to imagine kind of divine love flowing like a river into that injustice. You don't have to think exactly about what that means and what that results in. Just sit with the metaphor for a moment. Divine love, present and active. Notice how it feels, what hopes might come up for you. And then in that moment, you can pray. Pray that those who are in need of justice, that this is what we'd experience, divine love flowing in that direction. For those who want to participate in God's justice, how to join in with that river and become a part of it. And once you've prayed, that's the end of your reflection.